seated. This may not come as a surprise to those of you who know me, but I was a somewhat high-spirited child. I questioned and I challenged. I remember asking my Sunday school teacher when I was maybe 11 or so, why is Easter more important than Christmas? Because if Jesus had not been born, he would not have died or resurrected. My question reflected a child's logic, although I like to think of it as the beginning of my incarnational theological leanings. But either way, my teacher did not have an answer for me. Actually, what was going on was my need to question, to test, and most fundamentally, to think. And this need did not change, and nor did others' inability to know how to deal with my challenges, other than to not know what to do with them, and therefore what to do with me. This was especially true in the Armenian church in which I grew up, which remains tied to traditions and ways of thinking that date from the early centuries after Christ. So I then took comfort in these Bible passages, those that we heard today that depict Jesus as not being recognized or given due honor, or that show Jesus challenging the traditions and ways of behaving of his time, such as when he heals on the Sabbath or overturns the tables of the money changers at the temple. I also took to heart his advice to the disciples that they should leave wherever they are not listened to and shake the dust off their feet on their way out. Today, though, what are we to make of such advice? If you were here last week, you heard Michelle in her testimony speak about truth and how we are to know what is true. She proposed that the measure of truth is whether it bears good fruit, the fruits of the Spirit. Jesus wanted his ministry and that of his followers to be fruitful, to change things, to heal people, to make a difference in their lives. And so should we. This is the call to everyone who calls themselves a Christian and a follower of Jesus. But how are we to know what we are to do, and even how we are to be in this mad, mixed up, and increasingly dangerous world in which we live? And how are we to know whether to stay or leave? Jesus left Nazareth when he could do no good works there. And he directs the disciples to leave the place they are if their preaching and healing are not welcome. Should we do the same? Believe me, I have no answers to these questions. In fact, my search for wisdom and direction seems increasingly fraught. I find it more and more difficult these days to know what to do. I so often feel powerless to be effective in this world. Some days, most days, the news feels like an assault, accompanied my cries of, "I can't believe it," or "How could this be happening?" What I do know, though, is that at the heart of Jesus' ministry was a certain kind of power. It was the power to change people's lives. He was so attuned to the presence and activity of such power that, as we heard in last week's gospel, when the hemorrhaging woman touched him, he felt the power go forth from him. He did not see her touching him, but felt the connection and exchange. That power healed her and changed her. To follow Jesus, we need to feel we have power to make change possible. And yet more and more, I, for one, feel powerless. But I also know I can't stay in that place. And maybe that is a key here. Jesus leaves when his offerings are not received, and he directs the disciples to do so too. But their leaving doesn't mean giving up. It means moving on. Moving on from powerlessness, moving on to something that might make a difference. Moving on to what is creative and good and true. One of the most profound books I ever read is called Tomorrow's Child. It was written by Rubem Alves, a South American liberation theologian. It was published in 1972, over 50 years ago. That's when I read it, and I still think about it. Alves's intended audience for this book was North Americans, even though he was South American. He argued that the American system and its uses of power was getting increasingly untenable and absurd. Alves's writing is rich with metaphors and analogies, and he likened the American system to dinosaurs, which were destined to extinction because they were too strong, too powerful. And they, the dinosaurs, and we in this country operated by a certain logic. And I quote, "We operate under the illusion that the dinosaur can be convinced by means of arguments. And we forget that by its logic, anything that does not increase its power is a priori ruled out as false and evil." Given this, Alves writes, what Christians need to do, what nurtures hope, is creating living communities that embody the values that we want to preserve, and waiting so when the time is ripe, we are prepared. To this society seeking instant gratification, he suggests that it is not a time to plant pumpkins, which are quick to come to harvest, but it is a time to plant dates, which come to fruition more slowly. So slowly that we may not ourselves see the fruits of our labors. We are planting for future generations to harvest. As difficult as that may sound, it does speak to the need for a kind of discipline that we may yet have to develop. Such discipline is countercultural. It does not seek satisfaction for itself, but works for the nurture of others. It's countercultural because it does not buy into the values of this world that is built on greed and selfishness and control. It is countercultural because it nurtures imagination and creativity. 3 days ago, July 4th, we celebrated Independence Day, the birth of our democracy. Many churches today are focusing on marking Independence Day, and we too had a prayer for that. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. In 2 years, we as a country will be celebrating the 250th anniversary of our independence and the struggle for democracy. Given that our democracy is more and more under threat, what exactly will we be celebrating then? Given that democratic principles are fast becoming countercultural values, what will those celebrations look like? So maybe it is time to move on in search of new ways of being and acting. Maybe it is time to reimagine power as Jesus understood it. Power not to control, but to enable life to flourish. Maybe it is time to develop disciplines and strengthen communities that are able to sustain us in this moment. May it be that time. Amen.